Putin has already attempted to detonate a nuke, was stopped by sabotage, insider says. Russian expert believes senior level officials are working against Putin to prevent nuclear detonations in Ukraine. A Moscow insider has claimed that Russian President Vladimir Putin recently attempted to detonate a nuclear weapon, but that his efforts were sabotaged by top brass at the Kremlin. The report published at the Mirror also says unspecified technical issues could account for the failure of Russian nukes in recent weeks. Unspecified. Well, of course, this could only mean one thing. Aliens. Because that's the conspiracy theory that whenever, like the aliens shut down the nukes. This is actually, people actually talk about it. I don't know. I don't know why they think that's true. I mentioned this briefly before the show. I said, I think it absolves humanity of responsibility, and that's why people want to believe it. The reality is, I'll put it this way. World leaders, they're not above you. If you sit down if you're in a bar, you wouldn't even realize you're talking to someone because people are just people. You go into the courts, you meet politicians, you meet enough people, you meet people who are wealthy and own things, and you realize everybody sort of acts the exact same way. Obviously, people know different things. People have access to different things. But what I'm trying to say here with this is when your neighbor got angry at you over some petty BS, that same level of emotion can happen with someone like Putin, who's got his finger over the button.
Do you think this story is true, Doug?
I really don't buy it. I don't have any idea what Putin would have to advantage himself by detonating a nuke. I mean, obviously, he's talking. I'm no defender of Putin. I actually designed strategies to defend our allies in Eastern and Northern Europe against him. I don't want him in the Baltic nations. I don't want him in Poland, etc. But he needs to talk about nukes as a deterrence against the U.S. and NATO. Obviously, a red line for him was 2014, of course, when a new government came in that was pro-West, pro-EU, pro-NATO. We've seen a similar situation in 2008, of course, with Georgia. Georgia was bucking real hard and working real hard to get NATO membership, and Vladimir Putin's like, oh, no, you're not. So he swept in Abkhazia, South Ossetia in Georgia and waged that war, achieved his objectives, had a buffer zone, and then stopped. This, I have to say, I'm pleasantly surprised by the actions of the Ukrainian armed forces. Just who would have known that they would be able to stop Vladimir Putin and actually have a counteroffensive?
Yeah, well, they were training since 2014. U.S. Special Operations were down there training every single one of them and preparing the landscape. And when you're an invading army, you don't have the advantage. They have home territory, and they have all the latest and greatest U.S. technology. Now, I actually read this article, and this article's all over the place. Number one, the Mirror doesn't have the best reputation. And they say in the article, quote, insider claims the launch was not done because of technical failure or by reluctant military chiefs. So again, who's the source? Who's telling you these stories? And number two, you can't even get the story correct. Which one is it?
The Mirror is NewsGuard certified, Luke. What do you mean? NewsGuard says it's good.
And another thing to understand here, there is a chain of command specifically with Russia when it comes to launching nuclear weapons that people should know about, because it's not just Vladimir Putin pressing his finger on the button. He also, in Russia, they also have something that's sort of similar like the nuclear football, but they have a briefcase that essentially notifies the general staff. The general staff have access to the launch codes. Then, after the general staff get the launch codes, they could give it to individual weapons commanders. Then they, of course, execute the procedure. Then they send the nuke. So that's the protocol. That's the chain of command that they have in Russia, which I think is also important to understand here. It's not just one guy pressing the button. And there are ways that the chain of command, the general staff, or the individual commanders could say, no, this is crazy. So, and that's a likely scenario here.
Okay, but how about this? Putin leaked the story on purpose to scare people in the West to think that he's actively prepared and wants to use nukes. You know what I mean? Like saber rattle to the extreme degree.
Yeah, but there is merit to that. We listen to any of his major speeches, and usually something about nukes comes up, or through a proxy of his. And so, yes, that's his deterrent model. Much as Saddam Hussein, I was part of Desert Storm liberating Kuwait, a war for energy, by the way, and we knew that. But then Saddam Hussein got rid of his chemical biological weapons, didn't tell the West, but he kept talking about he's going to use them against us as a deterrent. So I do believe that's a possibility. Putin wants us to know that if we take it to the next level, there's a high danger that it's going to escalate.
What do you think? I'm not asking because I haven't read a lot about this or that the audience doesn't have an idea, but I'm curious your thoughts. Why do you think Putin decided to invade Ukraine, and why is this happening?
Vladimir Putin has a bunch of problems on his hands. First off, he's a single commodity country. Basically, it's oil and gas. A few years ago, it was $70 billion a year. Now it's over $100 billion thanks to the gas prices. A couple issues, though. Ukraine has been drawing closer and closer to the EU, NATO, and the United States. The government is very pro since 2014. when most of these troubles began. He also has a population problem in that his demographics are shrinking as far as ethnic European Russians. I'm not talking about the Asians that make up most of his country. And that demographic, he would like to have them in my studies within his sphere of influence. I think the most vulnerable place in Europe, other than Ukraine, is eastern Latvia, Daugavpils. When I visited there some years ago, I did not feel safe. And I was there in civilian clothes with a Danish buddy of mine. And it's like 90% ethnic Russian, and most of the Russians there stayed as a result of the Cold War, being stationed there. Their dads were military members or intel officials, and they're receiving a stipend from Moscow, by the way, as well, about up to $1,000 a month to live.
The Russian citizens, they're there? Are?
The Latvians who are ethnic Russians.
Yeah, things don't look very promising for the Russian Empire, and population decline is another major factor. And now with this war, that only has been exacerbated that much worse. It's a petro-state. Ukraine is also going to challenge them, specifically with the national resources that they have, the gas that they have, specifically in the regions that Vladimir Putin now is occupying inside of Ukraine. So there's a lot of things happening behind the scenes. There's, of course, NATO and their influence and them being on their border. There's, of course, the sphere of influence that Russia wants to still maintain in this specific region. And it's a back and forth challenge. And I think it was a desperate move. It was a desperate situation. And it's a crazy situation that's only going to get crazier from here.
And he needed a decisive knockout blow in that first week. And when the Russian air assault and airborne units came into the airport outside of Kyiv, those are Putin's best forces. There's two armies in Russia that I call. You have the specially trained, highly motivated ones like the airborne special forces, air assault, and then you have the rest. And the rest right now you're seeing being grinded down by the Ukrainians. When they were beaten back, that was a clear sign that Putin was in trouble. This is going to be a long, protracted war.
I remember seeing them land in the airport inside of Kiev and then not hearing anything else about them because they were nowhere to be found. And I'm like, that doesn't really make sense. This looks like a failed operation.
That's his A-team. But if you remember in Grozny, when the Russians... So it's about buffer states. Luke, you said it. It's a buffer because Napoleon and the Germans in 2 wars and what have you. When the first attempt to go into Grozny in the Caucasus, and the Russians were beaten back, and eventually came back with overwhelming force. And I don't think Putin has that leeway, though, right now.
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's reasonable, in the sense of an armistice, for eastern Ukraine to be split between the Ukrainians and the Russians? Those freeways that go into Crimea. I think that's ultimately the goal, is to take those freeways to turn Crimea and Sevastopol into a trade hub. But do you think that's reasonable for Ukraine and Russia to share those freeways, to each take one and then or neutralize the territory in some sense?
Are you saying like the eastern region goes to Russia?
Or make it neutral, or just the freeway from the Donbass? There's 2 of them, and one of them could be Ukrainian and one of them could be Russian.
So the land bridge that you're describing, Ian, is exactly what Vladimir Putin needed. And I think actually his idea of driving that land bridge west towards the Transnistria, which is a breakaway republic on the Ukrainian, Romanian borders. I think he wants to have a broader pro-Russian area underneath his grasp. It does remind me a bit, analogies historically are dangerous, but Sudetenland, 1938, Czechoslovakia, Germans there in Czechoslovakia, and of course I'm going to go, and the bad guy Hitler goes in and liberates, quote unquote, and we're seeing a similar thing. But the problem with Putin is the resolve of the West. I mean, how many billions of dollars of American money has gone in there?
At least 100 on the books.
Sick.
I mean, it was at least
there's secret budgets and then there's public budgets. The public budget is around 60 to 80 to 100 people guesstimate right now. But the House right now is talking about doing another $60 billion bill specifically just for Ukraine. That's a lot of money.
And you think about the Germans are so proud because they came out and they announced they're giving $2 billion to the Ukrainians to fight the Russians. But the dirty little secret is they're paying $2 billion a month for Russian oil and gas. The hypocrisy. When Trump remember in 2018 in the UN, Trump gave a speech and lectured the Germans about Reliant, and they were laughing at him and mocking him. Who's laughing now?
Yeah, not the working class in this country who are looking at their gas tanks going. We hit, what was it, 5 something a gallon? It went down. Now it's going back up. California, it's $8 in some parts.
Or the Germans who are told prepare not to take hot showers this winter because of energy costs.
Did you hear this? The BBC is preparing scripts for when they have to announce the blackouts in the UK.
It's UK now.
That was the Guardian. We talked about that the other day.
Yeah. Do you see any resolution to this? Because all I'm seeing is escalation. Obviously, the winter is going to stop a lot of the fighting. But Putin is kind of posturing like he might launch another invasion from the north with Belarus right now. All I see is escalations. Do you see any way that this could possibly de-escalate? I know Putin said he's open to negotiations during the upcoming G20 meeting. Do you think that's going to be successful?
I viewed a Russian broadcast last night that was talking about how there's going to be no operations this winter. I think there probably will be, but it'll be minor. I see no off-ramp this year.
Yeah.
What do you think an off-ramp would look like?
Negotiated peace, but it's going to have to be the United States. This is a hard thing to say. Do you tell Ukraine to give up, Ukrainian territory? You know what the sad thing is? Well, is it sad? I don't know. 1994, the Bucharest Treaty. Remember that? That Ukraine was like the third largest nuclear power in the world at the time.
That's right.
And the United States, Russia, and Great Britain promised to defend their borders if they'd give up the nukes. And they gave up the nukes, and who's defending their borders? That's the problem we have.
And Russia promised not to invade them if they gave the nukes.
That's
right. And then here we are today.
And the problem with this is it sends a signal to every country: build nukes as fast as possible, or else.
Exactly.
That's nightmarish.
That's what the Indian General Staff, after the Desert Storm in 1991, and that was my first combat experience there, they did a study in 92 saying we have to get nukes to prevent this kind of attack on us from any country, not specifically the United States.
Yep.
They're the breadbasket of Europe. They're, and they have a long, tumultuous history. I called them the Afghanistan of Europe, because when you look at all the violence, all the bloodshed, specifically in Ukraine, it is a major clash point. And people were kidding themselves not to see this as an upcoming major proxy war that's happening right now. And, I could only hope it de-escalates, but I think this could even last a decade. I think it could even last more than that, especially with the way that these wars are fought, especially with how close the people are, especially how there's neighbors fighting against each other, which is atrocious, which is absolutely horrible. I think we should try to stop it, but at the same time, I don't see it stopping anytime soon.
Ukraine would have to sacrifice the eastern region. They'd have to give that up. It's unless Putin just eventually gives up. But I think Putin can and will use nukes. Albeit, I don't have nearly the military expertise you do, Senator. But my concern is that Putin he's ideological, and he's looking at the end of the great Russian Empire, of what Russia is. I don't see him just eventually going like, well, we lost this one. I think he looks at it like, we will be great. We will never back down under no circumstances.
If he loses in Ukraine, he's done.
Right.
And you hear rumblings now. I don't think it's as viable as Western commentators are saying, because he's been very successful in eliminating opposition around him the past 2 decades. Actually, he's actually the longest ruler since the czars at this point here. I mean, it's incredible. Ukraine, wow, if they can push through this winter here and then have time to rearm and refit and retrain with all this new equipment and this money, hopefully, that's going to the battlefield, they might be able to start putting the Russians back. But then what do you do, Vladimir Putin, when your armies are pushed out? And that might happen.
Nukes.
Or buy it.
Small ones.
Can they afford to buy eastern Ukraine? Isn't it cost them $300 billion?
The Chinese are.
$500 billion.
Yeah. Well, this is why the Chinese have a weird kind of situation on their hands here, because they're a big trading partner with Ukraine. They have a lot of relations with Ukraine. But at the same time, they're still geopolitically opposed against the United States. So this is a very weird situation for them. They're kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But I think they're also a country that we should be looking at right now, especially when it comes to Taiwan, especially when it comes to the bigger geopolitical picture, especially with BRICS and the petrodollar in question with Saudi Arabia.
Thanks for checking out this segment from the Timcast IRL podcast. But if you want to check out the full show live, tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. And if you want more special access content, head over to timcast.com and become a member. Your membership helps sustain this company, keep our journalists employed, makes this show happen, and you will get access to exclusive members-only segments of the Timcast IRL podcast, and there's a massive library to check out. So again, go to timcast.com or tune in Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., and we'll see you all there.